You're listening to the ONSIDE Podcast, the podcast for innovation-driven entrepreneurship here in Atlantic Canada. I'm your host, Alex McCann. This is Season 2, and the theme this month is the journey of becoming an entrepreneur. I'm joined today by Michael Marcel Polak, also known as Ganagawatrita. Hopefully I've gotten that somewhat okay, which means Little Dipper in Mohawk from the Bear Clan. He's dedicated to fostering Indigenous pathways to solve global problems through his gift of two-eyed seeing. He's working to incorporate Haudenosaunee Great Peace into modern innovation frameworks such as design thinking, human-centered design, and agile to develop what he calls creation-centered design, and is committed to helping organizations around the world and communities reconcile different ways of thinking using Indigenous worldviews and others. All right, Michael, I'm so happy to welcome you to the ONSIDE Podcast. Thanks for joining us. I shared a little bit with our guest, a little bit about your background, but of course, I always like to give my guests an opportunity to have you tell us a little bit about yourself in your own words. So who is Michael? What are you all about?
Yeah, well, I guess first I'll say Nyawen, which is Mohawk for thank you. Thank you for having me. Who am I? I love this question. And, it's interesting. So typically in a community, when we would say an introduction or respond to a question similar to like, who are you? Or nice to meet you, it would be more, we would say like, what is the land where you are from? And so I feel a sense of responding and answering that question to tell you a little bit about who I am, but also a little bit about the land that I'm from. Because it embodies some of the characteristics, and it's also taught me a lot of lessons. So, as you noted, my name, Ganagawatrita, which means Little Dipper, or roughly translated, little bear in the sky, little bear in the stars.
I like that.
And I'm Mohawk, and I'm Polish. And it's important for me to mention those elements of my identity because I grew up very close to both of those cultures.
Interesting.
I knew my family. I knew where I came from. I knew my grandfathers and my grandmothers on both sides. I knew my parents and my cousins. And growing up, I was able to observe the contrast between those cultures throughout my whole life and really kind of start to highlight them as I always would look back and start to reflect on the experiences I had. And so I'll start there with myself more in the family element before I speak to the land. And so my mother's Mohawk and my father's Polish. And in Mohawk or Haudenosaunee community, we would say, you are what your mother is.
Right. And did your mother give you that name?
No.
Oh, okay.
No. So traditionally when one gets their name, there's a little bit of ceremony behind it. And so I received that name through ceremony. And actually, my naming ceremony was very unique, not traditional in the sense of Mohawk. But perhaps that's a different path.
Back to the land. We'll get to there. We'll circle back around this. I feel like there's an interesting story there, but back to the land.
Yeah. And my observations around the contrast between my families and cultures growing up. And so one thing that I observed is that my Polish family always seemed to have more opportunities. And so my Polish grandfather, he was a prisoner of war. And he, near the end of the World War II, he escaped and came to Canada, settled in Hamilton. He was a carpenter. And he built homes with his skills of carpentry. And once he was settled here in Canada, he had built 7 homes on the same street. He owned them and rented them out. And over the course of his life, he sold those homes and used them to provide for the family. My Mohawk grandfather was an iron worker in New York and Buffalo,
right,
which is a very common trade for our community. And as a direct relationship to the Indian Act here in Canada, my Mohawk grandfather was not allowed to own anything. So not allowed to own or accumulate assets or wealth as a function of the relationship with the Crown. And so both grandfathers were working in skilled trades, hard workers, worked their whole life. One was able to build and own assets and the other wasn't. And that's just one generation for me and my family. But the result of that, when I look at and observe my family, is I like to look at, as an example, my cousins for perspective. And so all of the Polish side of the family, all my cousins own their homes, have university degrees, married, healthy lifestyle, healthy family. They own assets, have savings, educated. And it's the exact opposite on the Mohawk side of the family. Nobody has beyond a high school education of all of my cousins. Many of them had kids at a really young age. And over the last 4 years, 2 of my cousins have died as a result of opioid crisis.
Oh, wow.
And so these like symptoms of this ability to kind of, this contrast, this ability to participate in an economy, or the exclusion from participation in an economy is probably more appropriate. And so that really kind of impacted me, because I'm looking at this and I'm thinking about, my unique situation sitting in between those two worlds and being able to be the only person on the Mohawk side of my family to have obtained a, graduate degree and gainful employment, and kind of correct that trajectory of that side of the family. But I also appear, I'm white passing. And so it's like an interesting observation that I've just been reflecting on it. And then, transitioning over to the land. So like I was born in Hamilton, Ontario, which others refer to as the armpit of Canada, right? It's a blue-collar town, an industrial city, which, the economy was really built on the steel industry and the manufacturing industry. But there's a unique thing about Hamilton that I've experienced growing up, where there's an area of town around Lake Ontario where all the steel mills are, and it just seems perpetually gray. It's always kind of dark and smoggy. And when you're arriving into town, into Hamilton, a very distinguishable scent of sulfur will enter the nostrils as you're getting you have to drive past the steel mills if you're coming from the east, from Toronto into Hamilton. So you drive by this strip of steel mills and industry, whether the windows are up or down, the smell permeates. And that smell is familiar to me and feels like home. But my observation is, with that economic development that happened and that industrialized development, it created a situation where the relationship with the environment, like the lake around that area, is not, you can't swim there. There's been an impact on creation, on fish life and wildlife in that area. And directly 30 minutes away from there is the community that I grew up frequenting, spent time. So my grandfather and our family is from Diandanega, which is near Bay of Quinte. But he came down and settled because his work was in Buffalo and Niagara Falls and New York. So he settled in the closest community there, which would be Six Nations of the Grand River, or as we would say, Oswego. Oswego means the land where the river parts. And he settled there. Now, Six Nations, that community, if you were to pull it up on Google Maps from satellite view and look down at it, you would notice and you would observe this patch, this area, which is a deep, deep, deep dark green in comparison to everything that surrounds it. And that deep dark area is Six Nations of the Grand River. And everything else you would see like gray, the development of cities, and you would see really light green where there's kind of agriculture, but the reserve, that the community, it's very dark. And that area sits in what we call the Carolinian zone. Okay, that landmass represents about 1% of the landmass in Canada, but it represents the most biodiverse area in all of Canada.
Interesting. Old
growth forest, species that don't exist anywhere else, and a diversity of species that you can't find anywhere else in Canada. And so that contrast from where I grew up, even from looking at the city and the economic development that occurs and the impact that that has on the land, and completely gray in certain areas of Hamilton, and only a small drive away, you arrive at the Indigenous community where I grew up, which is the most biodiverse area in all of Canada.
Interesting.
And so it's these conflicting, contrasting perspectives that have shaped my experience growing up and weighed heavily on the way that I view the world and entrepreneurship and business and relationships.
Wow. Thank you so much for opening us up that way and sharing a lot about your family and your background and both sides of your family and that contrast that you observe in your family and in your direct relations, and then also in the land and the environment that you found yourself. It's this kind of this space of being on the edge between two worlds. And one thing I wanted to touch on that you kind of mentioned as you were talking and saying, the things that you saw kind of in the Polish side of your family, and then the things you were noticing in your Mohawk community, and impacts from the Indian Act that were preventing people from accumulating wealth in the modern world in the way that we assume that wealth is generated and how we value things today. So you could see these kind of conflicting opportunities, as it were. Yeah. And, we've talked before, so I know you're really into finding new ways to do things, entrepreneurship, startups, all these kinds of things. And we're going to journey into how you started to think about becoming an entrepreneur. But was there something about that dichotomy between the two things that got you interested in entrepreneurship? Or was there something that was there where because you mentioned that there were these two different ways of approaching things. Was there something there that sort of got you interested or led you in that direction?
I'm not certain if there was something that, as a result of that experience and those observations, that led me specifically to entrepreneurship. But it certainly reinforced, so entrepreneurship, if I think about that by definition, there's kind of the basic definition, which is just around creating a business for profit. And then the more modern definition, which is really around trying to observe problems or complex problems that exist in the world and try to find solutions to those. And so on that more modern definition, I think that's where I saw an opportunity that maybe is not being widely practiced around trying to reconcile those differences, to create solutions to help change things for the better, whether, business, society. So in a sense, yeah, but I don't know when I can't pinpoint a time when I was like, oh yeah, like this is also valuable for business or something.
And what was it for you that, because I know you have I feel like you told me once, I could be wrong about this, correct me. I feel like you told me once that you started a skate shop or a skate business, or I know that you had some different things you were interested in at a kind of a young age. So what was your kind of first foray that made you say, okay, I want to solve some problems, make some money, go down this path? A lot of people we've talked to have said they didn't even know the word entrepreneurship. That wasn't a word that occurred to them or that they had even considered themselves to be. Was there something that kind of made you interested in going down that path, or something that happened early in your life?
Well, okay, now we're getting into some interesting stuff. And this may also help answer the last question as well. Everywhere that I would go, and I would walk throughout the world with my perspective, I would find that there was some resistance to indigenizing things. And, you get to a certain level of decision makers, and that's just not a priority. It's not the top priority. It's in some cases not a priority at all. And so entrepreneurship is appealing to me in the sense of, well, I have the ability to lead and decide how this looks. 5 years ago, nobody really was mainstream talking about two-eyed seeing, and 10 years ago, certainly nobody was. So thinking about how to blend Indigenous principles or ideas or perspectives into business, whether it's like policy or decision-making criteria, like these weren't even topics. Like if you brought them up, you would almost be like looked at like you're like, what are you talking about? This is for you to do in your community, not here. So that element of having some autonomy over how to approach design or solutions or business and trying to bring that into the space and so I remember I came out of, like, I just finished doing, I got my diploma in business and I went out into the workforce and I just didn't like it. Like, nothing about it set me on fire. You know, I actually remember the first thing I did out of college was I went for an insurance interview, and the final round of interviews, they said, like, you're going to go out with one of our sales reps into the market and we're going to show you kind of like a day in the life. And I think there might have been like skewed to try to show me like what a rough day in the life is like, you know, see if you can cut it. And it was, you know, door to door, knocking on doors.
Oh God.
Trying to sell insurance. And I remember there was an elderly couple and we ended up sitting around the table with this insurance sales rep and these two elderly people, and the way that they were selling the insurance, something about it just didn't sit right for me. And I left that day and I thought, I don't want to do that. I think I can do more than this. And so I kind of ventured out to think, well, you know, what energizes me? I was really into, I didn't even skateboard. I was into the style and the culture, and like my friends did, and I was around it, and just like the fashion. And it was really more streetwear. We weren't really a skate shop. It was more like streetwear clothing that, you know, kind of had some like skate elements.
Style.
Yeah.
Some finesse.
Yeah. And I just kind of wanted to do something fun and also a little bit of School of Hard Knocks. Like, yeah, I thought, like, I'm young. I have time for this. I have energy. If I fail here, I have tons of time to reassess and go back out into the world. So it just seemed like an acceptable risk, and it seemed like a way better option than cold calling for insurance policies.
Yes. Well, skater lifestyle business over insurance. Now, we all need insurance. It's all, you know, it's necessary.
Absolutely.
So insurance company, please don't cut me off. I need you.
Yeah.
All those are good things. All those are good things.
Keep the premiums low.
Yeah, low premiums. Low premiums. Low premiums. And so as you had that experience and building on kind of the things that you were sort of seeing in your life and your community, and as a person, you grew up in Hamilton? So were you surrounded by your Mohawk community? Were people in your community supportive of the idea of going into business or starting a business, or how was that perceived? And were there? Well, yeah, I guess maybe we could start there. How was that perceived?
At the time, it wasn't something that I vocalized. You know, I actually, when I opened that store, I came to Mi'kma'ki to open that. So I wasn't even close to my community. I didn't attempt to access any capital from any, you know, entrepreneurial grants or anything like that. It was almost like, for me, kind of a pilgrimage. It was like, let me go to an unfamiliar place and try something that I've never tried before. And there's maybe perhaps also a little bit of an element of like the disruptor in my identity as well. And like my community this is something. So my community is pretty well known to be vocal advocates for calling out injustices and standing up, like quite fearless in terms of standing up to government and policymakers and really claiming and reclaiming things that are legal promises. And so, you know, like if any other community, so all my friends that are from of different nation families, Anishinaabe and Mi'kma'ki, and any one of them who has spent time with Mohawk people, and specifically Mohawk women, would say, like, there's a lot of comments like in a playful way, like, don't mess around with them, or like, you know, oh, we need someone to like speak up, like, let's go and gather the Mohawks, you know? So it's like, there's this element of like, I don't want to say like resistance, but disruption, like positive disruption, and the willing and the desire to want to pursue that. And so I think there's an element of that that's entrepreneurial as well. You know, it's like, no, I'm not okay with the status quo. I'm going to go create my own version of this.
It's interesting. I was watching, first of all, I will attest to the strength of Mohawk women. this is a random piece of information, but when I was in high school, I went to school in New England, and there were quite a few Mohawk women on my volleyball team. They were hardcore. You did not want to mess with them. And a couple on the women's hockey team. I didn't play hockey, but they were, don't mess with them. They were some pretty strong and opinionated characters, at least on my team, from my limited experience. Well, it's interesting, we talked a little bit about your family, your background, some of the kind of disruptor things that have sort of you feel are coming out of your heritage and your Mohawk community, and then also trying some things here in Mi'kma'ki or in Nova Scotia, as other people might know it as. And you've been involved with working with Indigenous businesses and startups and other things like that. What's kind of going on right now in sort of Indigenous startup culture or business culture that's interesting or exciting? What do you see that's kind of going on now that people might not be aware of? I know there's this whole movement around Indigenomics and things like that.
Yes.
Yeah. So what's happening that's exciting you?
The exciting things that are happening around Indigenous business development and entrepreneurship, there's a lot of capital being allocated towards prioritizing the advancement of Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. So there's some great programs and grants and opportunities and energy behind trying to encourage more. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a necessity. So I feel like there's a little bit of a renaissance period happening and a resurgence around encouraging people to look around and explore problems and tap into Indigenous knowledge and culture as something that translates into value for business. Mm-hmm. And so, that's exciting. And those areas like our small business entrepreneurship in Indigenous communities, it's heavily skewed towards art.
Yes.
And artisanship and craftsmanship.
Right.
And so, leveraging the use of technology to get exposure to new markets through online sales. And not too long ago, you'd have to go to the reserve and find a craft shop to be able to get really unique products. And now we're able to kind of get those out into the market. There's also been a lot of call outs that have been happening over the past little while around are these authentic Indigenous products? Because the commercialization and
co-opting of people's cultures.
Yeah. A little bit of that kind of culture vulture stuff was happening. and so now there's some awareness around that. And people are kind of asking, where is this sourced? Where is this procured from? And is this authentic? And then honoring those artists and the unique designs from the different cultures. There's a ton of community supports. And I believe that on the other side, so outside of that art, heavily skewed and weighted emphasis on getting our artists exposure and being able to find markets for them to sell their creation. On the other side, there's a huge push and also understanding and awareness around resource development. And so the big major infrastructure projects and resource projects that are going to be required to move us into the future and this push towards the big Green Deal and all these things, there's an understanding that Indigenous equity partners need to be in place and Indigenous communities need to be engaged. And so a lot of businesses are coming up in and around that space, like remediation all the way through to green energy and different wind, solar, geothermal projects, and then solar and the fisheries. Here we saw a great partnership in terms of Clearwater and the Coalition of Indigenous Communities. So from smaller scale lifestyle businesses all the way up to major developments and huge infrastructure projects, there's a participation level that we've never seen. And there's an energy and awareness that I've never seen before. So
yeah, it's interesting. I feel like kind of what you're saying is true. I think for a very long time, people associated kind of the craft industries and baskets and traditional clothing or imagery and things like that as those are acceptable spaces for Indigenous businesses and startups and things like that. But we know that in the background that there have been these other major initiatives. The Clearwater one is a perfect one. And here in Nova Scotia, we see, whether it's up in Cape Breton or the wind farms that have been developed by Eskasoni and some of the other places, folks are showing up with real economic drivers and really participating and kind of leading the way, and really hope that continues.
Yeah. And, this is an observation I've seen as well, is that there's a lot more of our communities coming forward and leaning into our strengths and not being like, oh, this is what business is telling us we need to do, but like, this is what we do really, really well. And so, land stewardship and land management, that is, I think, a direct correlation to our involvement in infrastructure projects and mining and these things that are earth-moving projects. And it's imperative that Indigenous people are involved because we understand the geography and have a relationship with the land that goes back thousands of years. On the art and creative side, that's people tapping into their identity and their culture and their community, and they're sharing that out with the world. And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about some of the other elements that there's a huge movement around entrepreneurship, one of which would be in the storytelling space around content creation. So in that kind of creative industry as it relates to film, television, documentary TV series, and a lot of new up-and-coming Indigenous producers and directors and actors. And so storytelling has always been a means with which we would communicate and share knowledge. And now, like, through the use of digital media, a lot of that stuff is starting to make its way out into the mainstream, which helps everything because people get familiar, they understand the stories, they understand, well, what part of what these stories that are being told in Canada also relate to my identity as a Canadian, like as a non-Indigenous Canadian, but the history and the truth and the culture, these things that are being shared, they're directly related to my identity because of my proximity to the land. So those things that are really valuable and channeling them into business, and entrepreneurship, I think is really cool. And it's a cool thing that I'm observing. It's less of a propensity to try to focus on things that, it's like, even personally, I think about this. Am I going to spend time trying to develop an area of my weakness that's going to take me like years to become proficient at? But if I focus on something that's already my strength and I just go really hard and focus on developing that, I'm going to be really, really great at that one thing, versus I might be mediocre if I invest 2 years into something that I'm not great at. And so it's like, I think I'm starting to see how that's all kind of taking shape across the landscape,
Interesting. Yes, I think that's always a struggle, is like, how can you be really great at something or go turn your passions into your profession or into something that's meaning for you? I have a question, like, if you had some advice for a young Indigenous entrepreneur, or, somebody from your community or somebody from the community here who's interested in this path, they're starting to think about this journey. They're starting to see the success, as you mentioned, through other folks doing sort of content creation, some of the larger business opportunities and things like that. What would be your advice for somebody who wanted to kind of go down this pathway of sort of exploring in a way that resonates?
Well, I want to say something that's not Googleable.
Okay.
You know what I mean? 'Cause I feel like, it's like persevere, try harder, be fearless, all these things, right? But I think the first piece of advice I would share is I would encourage young Indigenous entrepreneurs and young entrepreneurs in general just to think about what is your motivation and what energizes you when you close your eyes and you envision what your life would be like in running a business. And like, why I think that's important is because the different level of complexity of different businesses, and I think there are lifestyle businesses that are amazing that you can have a little shop, like when I had the little retail store, and make a living and enjoy it and have fun and engage with fashion, like that was great. But then I came to a point in that situation where I thought, what I actually want to do is much bigger than this. Like, I want to have a bigger impact personally. And so just to kind of think about the problem that you're trying to solve and the business and is this a lifestyle business, or is this like a tech startup, or is this a manufacturing company? Like, and understanding the difference in complexities of and opportunities that exist in those things. The other thing I would say is every time I talk to young entrepreneurs anywhere, top 3 issues they always bring up, or top 3 challenges, are barriers to entry, with an emphasis on access to capital. So there's a ton of money floating around out here in the world, and a lot of it is earmarked for Indigenous majority-owned businesses. And so, sometimes it's easier to look at where the money is going to flow and think about the problems in that space and try to design a solution than to try to create a business and then look for money that doesn't fit into the criteria of where it's flowing. So, like, some entrepreneurs, they're not in love with their idea necessarily. They're in love with the idea of being an entrepreneur in any sense. And so if that's the case, think about what might make those barriers to entry a little bit easier, which is like, okay, $1 billion is getting allocated to housing. Well, maybe we can focus on housing solutions, because it's going to be easier for us to be able to access money to get this idea off the ground.
Okay, I like it. That seems like some good, keen advice. I might have one more question for you, if that's okay. And we can always loop back around if we need to. But a question that we like to ask many of our guests who show up here on the ONSIDE podcast is a question that comes up quite often, which is whether or not being an entrepreneur is something that is nurtured, or if it's something that's in your nature. And I don't know if you've thought about that before, but what do you think? Is it nurture or nature?
Okay, so I'm going to take this opportunity to circle back to the definition that we talked about before earlier, I may have referenced, which was sort of that entrepreneurship definition. Because before there was business, before the concept of economics existed, there was only creation. We could only interact with each other and things, our environment. And so from this context, the basic definition of entrepreneurship, the act of starting a business for profit, this concept isn't something that really exists within creation. That's something that humans created as a function of our economic relationships. So from that perspective, I think entrepreneurship is nurture. You're really taught that this is how the economy works, and this is how business, and this is how you start a business. And so, yeah, I think from that business mind, because if you take away the business element, it doesn't really work. On the more modern version, so the act of transforming the world by solving large-scale complex problems, this, I believe, is nature. I think there is something inside all of us, this desire to evolve and improve and make things better for one another and everything around us. So that desire to have open eyes and an open mind and find solutions, that I believe exists inside everybody. But doing it for money under the definition of just like creating a business for profit, I think that's something that we learn and we have learned.
Interesting. Well, that is awesome. I want to thank you so much for your time today and sharing all of your insights and stories with us. If folks want to connect with you, what is the best way that they can connect with you, Michael?
The best way, I'm highly engaged with LinkedIn. So, email's pretty active, and LinkedIn, I'm on there once a day and kind of scanning around, seeing what's happening, seeing what Indigenous entrepreneurs are doing. And so that's like preferred way to get in touch. And I'm pretty easily accessible that way.
Okay, that sounds awesome. And I just want to thank all of our listeners today. And please connect with ONSIDE. You can come to our website, onsidenow.ca, or you can also follow us on LinkedIn and on Twitter as well. We would like to thank Communities, Culture, and Heritage for your support. We're so grateful for your support in helping us make this podcast. Thanks so much. See you next time.
This has been a Podstarter production.